What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Raw Prospect Podcast. My name is Emmy Nixon. Today we're recording episode 156, March Madness, round one, takeaways, and then we're going to go through and rank our top five favorite moves from free agency so far. But before that, join me from Austin, Texas, as always, the Stat King himself, Mr. Michael Ween. What's up?
March Madness is underway. It's March 18th, a Saturday afternoon, a day podcast. Isn't that a surprise? Um, as Emmy said, March Madness takeaways. A lot happened in round one, the round of 64. We got some big upsets as always. And then we got some chalk too, some storylines to talk about. And then over the second half of the podcast, we'll be doing our top five favorite free agent signings plus an honorable mention. So I did not include trades in my list, but Emmy may have. So we'll cover that. And then we'll likely be recording another podcast that will be releasing in a couple days. It won't be a live podcast, it'll be recorded. And we'll be covering some basketball, probably NBA, and some baseball, whether that be Major League Baseball or the World Baseball Classic, which is really heating up right now. USA takes on Venezuela tonight in a quarterfinal matchup. So that should be exciting. But with all that being said, let's just get right to the chase here. You take us where you want to go. Round one, there was a lot that happened. Where do you want to go first?
Well, I think we should probably start with the big upsets, and I guess we can start with Thursday's big upset. That was Arizona getting taken down by Princeton, 59-55. Game was really close until all the way up until the late stages. Um, really low scoring, a lot of missed open shots on the Arizona side of things, but it just seemed to me, and this seemed to be the case in a lot of the upsets that took place. Princeton just went into it with the right mindset in order to compete and go after loose balls, and it just seemed like they were playing with house money. That's how it always is in March Madness. The underdog team always comes in playing loose and free and just with pace, and it always presents a tough challenge for some of these top seeds. And obviously, we saw two top seeds get taken aback by it, and this one was just so shocking. Just when you looked at the halftime score and you saw Princeton was like right in the thick of things, I was like, okay, Arizona should pull away at some point in the second half, right? And then it just never seemed to happen.
Well, Arizona is a team that the past couple of years, even though Tommy Lloyd, their second year head coach, has been a fantastic regular season coach. I mean, he's one of the best. He's got one of the best records among all coaches during the regular season. Arizona runs through the Pac-12 tournament. They beat a beat up UCLA team at that, but they still won that game to win the Pac-12 tournament. They were a really good team at home this year, and they really thrived on getting out on the fast break and letting those big guys, Tubelis and Umar Ballo, run the floor and finish on the interior. And it just seems like, as you said, the longer you let these mid-major, double-seeded teams hang around, um, the more tense it gets for the higher-seeded team. And Arizona, just like always, how it always is with these higher-seeded teams, they tensed up and they couldn't make shots. Kirk Risa seemed a little bit off. And Arizona didn't run as much as I thought they would. I thought they would sort of out-athlete Princeton and get out in the fast break, try to play at their pace. But give Princeton credit. Their coaching staff did a great job at just instilling that toughness in those players. and being physical in the half court with Arizona and trying to give them a taste of their own medicine. Late in that game, Princeton was not like relying heavily on the 3-point shot to score the basketball and win that game. They were getting inside, they were drawing fouls, they were getting to the free throw line. And that's what you have to do in those games against more athletic teams. You just have to kind of use their own medicine against them, if you will, and give credit to Princeton's coach, everyone on that team. They just kind of stopped Arizona from getting to their game, which is running the floor and getting the ball to their bigs on the inside, playing that inside out basketball that we all saw them play throughout the regular season. And that's really what it came down to is Princeton sort of took Arizona out of their game, and the longer they hung around, the more tense Arizona got. And that's how these things work usually. So if that's all that needs to be said there, I want to go to the other big upset that happened on Thursday, which was the Virginia Cavaliers losing to the Furman Paladins, who earlier today, got knocked out by a really good San Diego State team who advances to the Sweet 16, the first team to do so. Congratulations to the best team in the Mountain West, the San Diego State Aztecs. But the reason I want to talk about Virginia is because it was just surprising the way that they ended up losing that game. When I think of Virginia losing that game, I did not think it would play out with Kihei Clark making that, I'm just going to call it flat out, a stupid decision. First of all, you don't dribble yourself or you don't even pass it into the corner. So this can't all be on Kihei Clark because they inbounded the ball to Reese Beekman, who then passed it into the corner to Kihei Clark. And you knew a trap was coming. You had to have known a trap was coming. Not all the blame should be put on Kihei Clark because I think Tony Bennett ought to have, some blame in this, as this seemingly keeps on happening to Virginia aside from that 2019 tournament title run, which they deserve all the credit for. And Kihei deserves a lot of credit for that too. But it seems to me that should be common sense in basketball that you just don't pass into the corner, especially when you know that Furman is on a run. They have the momentum. They're within, I think it was 2 points. And Kihei Clark is your shortest player. And he panicked and he threw the ball. He thought he could throw the ball probably further than he did. But if you're going to throw that ball, you got to throw it as high as possible to ensure that if Furman intercepts it or gets it, time runs out on them, or there's little to no time for them to get a shot off. But he threw it. He couldn't get it, as far as he wanted to, and he threw it back into play. Furman intercepts it at half court and makes a great pass to the PJ, forgetting his name, Pegues guy, who drills the 3-pointer, and that was that. It was just, I don't think those type of weird mistakes for a veteran Virginia team under a coach like Tony Bennett, I just didn't envision it happening that way. It was a popular upset pick coming into the tournament. I didn't have it in my bracket, but I just didn't envision Virginia losing in that fashion with that mistake. But it happened. Kihei Clark, I'm sure he's terribly upset that he made that mistake, but he also made arguably the best pass in Virginia history with the pass to Mamadi Diakite to tie the game in the Elite Eight in 2019 against Purdue, the game that, if you remember, Carson Edwards went off in. He, retreated to, past half court, made that one-handed pass to Mamadi Diakite just in time for him to get that little floater off to tie the game, send that game into overtime, and then Virginia pulled away on their way to a national championship. So my main point is, I thought Virginia would be better than that, but they made that mistake, and time will live on, I guess.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say other than Furman was making tough shots all game long. And you just got to give them credit. It really wasn't on the basis of like the entire game. it wasn't on Virginia's defense, I don't think. Obviously, there was a few breakdowns here and there, but for the most part, I thought Virginia defended well, forced them into like tough fallaways, but Furman just hung in there, made shots, got the stops when they needed to. And, in the end, things did bounce in their favor, but they had to hit that shot or else it was over for them. So it's like, um, some buzzer beaters are better than others. There's somewhere it's a tie game. You kind of have that insurance of, if we miss this, we're still going to be in overtime. But that was a all or nothing shot that
Right.
that PJ, I forget his name as well, but he absolutely drilled it. So I just got to give credit there, I think.
Here's an update. Tennessee up by 8 on Duke. 12:30 remaining in the second half. Duke
Wow.
is a team that I have getting all the way to the Final Four in my bracket. So my bracket actually did fairly well over the first 2 days of the tournament, better than I've ever done. I think the past couple years. Only two of my Sweet 16 teams getting knocked out in Virginia and Arizona, but nothing past that. So I was surprised that my bracket did well. Is there anything else from Thursday that stood out to you? I mean, I thought Texas did a really good job getting out and defending a 3-pointer on a team that really was the best statistically 3-point shooting team coming into the tournament. But Marcus Carr and Serge Ibaka Rice just continues to amaze. I think if Texas gets that sort of production from like the Christian Bishop on an interior drawing fouls, and then Dylan Dessou keeps doing what he's doing on the inside, plus the 3-point shot falls at a fairly consistent rate, Texas is going to be a tough out. I thought they did a really
Absolutely.
good job beating Colgate at their own game. The only thing that worries me is if they're not making those threes, Timmy Allen didn't look all that great to me. Where can they find offense? And it gives me some comfort that their offense on the interior, inside the paint with the Sioux and Christian Bishop, even Brock Cunningham at times getting on the offensive glass and finding guys on the outside or, drawing fouls on the interior. He's been big as well in some key moments for Texas, getting big offensive rebounds. Congratulations to Rodney Terry. And we're talking about a Texas team that, if they win tonight against Penn State, a Penn State team that can shoot the ball, uh, really well as well,
Mhm.
we're talking about the best Texas basketball season like half a generation, as they haven't made the Sweet 16 since 2008. So that's something to keep in mind since we are in Austin and I'm a big Texas fan. Uh, I think what Pittsburgh did to Iowa State yesterday really stood out to me. These 11-6 matchups I think have been really fun. The Pittsburgh Iowa State game, and then also late last night, TCU winning in the final seconds against a really good Arizona State team coached by Bobby Hurley. Really athletic with the Cambridge brothers. Can make shots as well. Pretty good defensively. TCU came back in the final 4 or 5 minutes of that game, led by their star Mike Miles Jr. Um, you know, TCU, that was a game that was critical for them to get by because now, Gonzaga is not going to be easy. But I thought that after watching Arizona State in that first 4 game on Tuesday or Wednesday, it was, um, man, I thought without Eddie Lampkin, TCU could have some troubles with Arizona State's athleticism and their length on the wing. Um, Getting it inside without Eddie Lampkin there, but give credit to Jamie Dixon's team. That's a much needed win for Jamie Dixon, who had success earlier in his coaching tenure at TCU in the tournament, but the past like 5 or 7 years hasn't had much success at all in getting wins in March. So I think that's a big win for TCU. So I think these 6-11 matchups, including that Creighton NC State game, have been really, really fun to watch.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny you mentioned TCU because I had actually turned that game off with about 5 minutes left, and then I woke up this morning, checked my phone, and I was just in shock. I had kind of ruled out the possibility of TCU coming back at that point because at that point, Arizona State's big man, I believe his name is Washington, was just dominating inside, offensive rebounds, putbacks, you name it. He was just imposing his will on the game, so it didn't feel like TCU was going to be able to turn that ship around just because they were getting dominated in such a physical manner. But give credit to them. I didn't get to see the end of that game, but that must have been an incredible comeback. The only other thing I wanted to mention was um, Houston getting by without Marcus Sasser. I think that was really big. They clearly did not play up to par, up to their standard. That game was close right up until the end, and if you didn't know, that was a 1 versus 16 matchup as well, and they were in for a real scare for a while there. I mean, um, I believe it was Northern Kentucky was just hanging around and hanging around, and it wasn't until right around 5 minutes left where Houston finally started making shots. So I think it was interesting to see some of the top teams handle their business, like UCLA, Texas, UConn, and then some of the other top teams. Some of them eliminated, and also some of them just scraped by. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
I want to give credit to Xavier, also in the Midwest region. They were down at one point by double digits to a scary Kennesaw State team, and they came back in that game. I had worries coming in. If you go back and watch our bracket prediction episode we recorded on Wednesday night, I had worries about Xavier's depth, but give credit to them and that coaching staff under Sean Miller. And we're going to get if you want to talk about round of 32 games, I'm excited to watch, not only because, you know, Texas could potentially play the winner of this game in the Sweet 16 if they advance tonight. But Pittsburgh and Xavier, an old Big East battle, those strong physical guards for Pittsburgh against Sully Boom, one of the more underrated point guards for Xavier, and Jamarius Burton for Pittsburgh. Jeff Capel's team really tough. Give credit to him. He should be in the running for Coach of the Year, in my opinion. Um, I think that's a really exciting matchup. It might not be like eye candy. It might not be the most fun game to watch, but it will be really close and competitive. So I think that's an interesting round of 32 game. The one other thing I wanted to mention is Creighton. Creighton is a team that I have going all the way to the Elite Eight. They were challenged yesterday by a really good NC State ball club. We talk about a really good, solid veteran backcourt and Jarkel Joyner, their point guard for NC State, and Traquavion Smith, a younger guy who can really shoot the ball and is extremely athletic. Could be a really interesting like draft project. In a couple years. NC State gave them trouble, but I thought Creighton with Kalkbrenner, I mean, man, that guy is good. Pick and rolls, finishing on the interior, getting offensive rebounds, blocking shots. He did everything. I thought he was one of the better, standout performances of round one. But that was a really fun game, a game that we talked about and we acknowledged that could be really fun to watch coming in just because those two teams, they love to run, get out in transition. They both had really good interior play. They could play inside out, which is a key aspect that you look for in teams that can make a deep run in March. With DJ Burns, I believe is his name for NC State, and then Kalkbrenner, the Big East Defensive Player of the Year in the Big East for Creighton, one of the best players in the country. I think Creighton, as long as Nimhard and their guards, Arthur Kaluma, give them solid production and shooting from the outside, from the perimeter, I think Creighton is poised to make a really deep run because Kalkbrenner, I think, at 7'1", with the way he can move and switch pick and rolls and defend on the interior, he's a really hard matchup. I worry about their depth sometimes, But as long as those guys don't get in foul trouble, I think they're in pretty good position to go pretty deep in the tournament. But that's another round of 32 matchup that I believe happens tomorrow. Creighton and Baylor. I mean, man, with Arizona losing, I know there's still Alabama at the top of that region, but that is a game that could potentially propel one of those teams, I believe, to the Elite Eight and maybe further if they get hot at the right time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Momentum is so big at this time of year. I think that's one thing that isn't thought about when making a bracket because, before the tournament starts, you're not thinking about, oh, this team beat this team, so they're going to be propelled by that victory and then, win games further beyond that. You don't really think about those types of, human aspects of things when you're making a bracket, but I think in the future that's going to be one thing I try to do is just think about some of the momentum with these teams. Um,
Absolutely.
okay, let's move over to yesterday's games, and I think it's a pretty obvious one to start off with that we have to discuss here. Furman Dickinson, 16 seed, took down number 1 seed Purdue, and it felt like even more symbolic just because you have on one hand the shortest team in the tournament whose tallest player is 6'7", and on the other side you have Purdue and Zach Edey, who will be the national player of the year, 7'4", like huge presence in the paint. And I even remember the notification. Watch Zach Edey take on the shortest team in the tournament. Like it felt humorous, honestly. But man, that Furman Dickinson team really they were just hounding the entire night. They came into the game plan. You got to give credit to that coach first and foremost. And then it felt a bit like if the 2020 Rockets were put into a college basketball game with the same schemes, just like with all just college basketball players. Just like that same theory of we're going to play small ball. We're going to use our speed and quickness to rotate defensively and double team and recover and just swarm on the defensive end of the floor. And on the offensive end, use our speed with cutting and spacing and just elite passing as well to just break down defenses. And it just all kind of worked together in a perfect storm. Um, there was a lot of loose balls that bounced their way, but you also have to give them credit in the fact that they went and got those loose balls. Like every single rebound, loose ball, there was guys staying back and just jumping after it. Even when Purdue secured a rebound, there would just be guys swiping at the ball, just hounding, just making sure they weren't comfortable. And those things make a difference. Whether you acknowledge them or not, they definitely make a difference.
Well, you have to give a lot of credit, and you mentioned it, to Tobin Anderson, their coach. And at this point, he's going to be getting some serious phone calls for bigger opportunities after the tournament ends for coaching jobs, I think. He just he's like exudes the confidence that you want a coach to exude in their players. And he said it after their win over Texas Southern in the first four in the locker room. If you saw the video, like, the more I watch Purdue, the more I think we can beat them, and give him credit for instilling that confidence in his players. Because with a team like that, you have to give them, like, you have to empower them and like make them think that they can win the game. And that's exactly what happened. I thought they came in with a very good game plan. The reason I worried, there were a couple reasons I worried about Purdue coming in, and that's why I only had them advancing as far as the Sweet 16 before I had them losing to Duke. Number one was their freshman guards, who actually played fairly well, I think. They missed some shots that they probably could have made, but I thought overall they did a pretty good job um, controlling the pace and taking care of the ball. Um, the stunning thing for me, though, was Zach Edey only getting one shot attempt in the final 12 minutes of the game. Like, that just cannot happen.
Right.
That's inexcusable. Um, Now give Fairleigh Dickinson credit. They were double and triple teaming him, forcing the ball out of the paint, making other guys for Purdue make shots, which they weren't able to do. As I said before, the longer FDU hung around, um, the tighter Purdue got. And you mentioned the hustle. They were playing with largely house money, as I think a bigger underdog in this game than UMBC was to Virginia back in 2018. They played really smart, and you have to give credit to Fairleigh Dickinson's game plan offensively as well, spreading them out, making Zach Edey guard in open space in those pick and rolls, getting him in a little bit of foul trouble. It was a solid, well played game from a really smart, high basketball IQ team in Fairleigh Dickinson. That although they are small and have some limitations, now you get a matchup with FAU in the second round. That I mean, if they play that same way, you can't tell me that's not a winnable game. Although Florida Atlantic is a really athletic, like high pace, high octane offense that can really get hot with some real good athletes. I mean, that would be a fun game to watch. Um, so yeah, I mean, give credit to Farley Dickinson, and if you're a Virginia fan or have been a Virginia fan in the past, you can finally exhale a little bit, knowing that you're not the only number one seed to lose to a 16 seed. You'll always be the first, and you really can't escape that. But at least you're not longer alone in that exclusive category, and you have some company to go along with it. And if you look at the KenPom numbers and the lines and so forth, um, it can be argued that Purdue losing to FDU is actually a bigger upset than UMBC beating Virginia. Although at the time it seemed unthinkable that Virginia would lose to UMBC, but in that UMBC game, they did not have DeAndre Hunter. So, I mean, that's a different conversation for another day. But at least you can exhale a little bit if you're UVA. That you lose to Furman this year, and it's not really getting talked about all that much because you had Arizona, a 2 seed, lose to a 15 seed, and you had Purdue, a number 1 seed, lose to a 16 seed, all in the same, within a span of 24 hours. So, yeah, I mean, it's a great story, and Tobin Anderson deserves a lot of credit for empowering his players. I don't think there's much of anything else that we need to cover. Give credit to Shaka Smart for getting past Vermont. That's a Marquette team that I believe is really dangerous. And Michigan State getting past USC, who gave them some trouble, but Michigan State eventually got past that game. Uh, I think that Michigan State Marquette game could be pretty good. Before we move on to NFL, and we'll have more March Madness reaction as we progress through the rounds here next week and so forth. Uh, there's already been a round of 32 game with San Diego State defeating Furman. The Duke Tennessee game is going on right now. Trying to get an update on that. What matchup are you most excited for in the round of 32?
I
Do you have
think the Tennessee Duke game that's going on right now, that was one that I had circled when I made my um, bracket, just because Tennessee, a lot of people were doubting them, despite them being a top 5 team in Ken Palm. And they've been really inconsistent offensively, but what they present defensively, I think, is just so interesting when you match it up against what Duke does. So, um, that'll be a really interesting result once we uh, finish up and then we can watch it later. But yeah, I really like that game.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I think I'm watching all the 3-6 matchups that we're getting in the second round. I love Creighton Baylor, as I mentioned before. Um, Kentucky getting past Providence, I think, is huge just for the morale of the Kentucky program. Getting an NCAA tournament win, getting back in the win column, going against K State with their fantastic combo and Marquise Noel and Keontae Johnson. And then TCU Gonzaga, I think it's going to be really good as well. I'm watching all three of those 6-3 second round matchups, which I believe will all take place tomorrow. So that'll be exciting. And then also, as I mentioned before, the old Big East battle, Sean Miller and Xavier going up against Jeff Capel's team in Pittsburgh. As I mentioned, it probably won't be the most fun game to watch, but it'll be really close and exciting in the end, I think. So yeah, I think that covers most of what we needed to talk about today. We covered the upsets, we covered some of the storylines, some of the basketball that we saw, our main takeaways. So, with that, let's move on to our second segment. This will be a really fun segment. And I think our free agency segments can sort of hopefully carry us right into our draft content that I think we should be starting relatively soon since some of these holes for some of these teams start to be filled and we start to get a better idea of what the draft might look like. Let's start with our honorable mentions. Who is your honorable mention? A signing that you still really liked but didn't quite make your list.
Um, my honorable mention was the NFC South as a whole. Really positioning themselves a bit more. I think all four of those teams um, made really nice moves. I thought to um, make this division, which was thought at the end of the season, oh, this division is going to be one of the worst in football next year. But by the time next year comes around, I think this division might be very competitive with four very, very evenly matched teams. Um, on the Panther side of things, they traded up for the number one pick, and all that entails. Um, the Falcons, in a signing that I'm going to mention later, they signed Jesse Bates on a uh, fairly cheap contract for what I was expecting. 16 million a year. That's really good value considering Derwin James got 19 per year and at the same position. Um, and then the Saints and the Bucks went out and signed quarterbacks. The Bucks signing Baker Mayfield, and then the Saints adding Derek Carr.
Okay. My honorable mention was more of an underrated signing, I thought. I'm going to go to the Cleveland Browns getting, forgive me if I mispronounce his name, Ogbo Okoronkwo. I definitely, uh, I definitely butchered that, but you know who I'm talking about.
Mhm.
An edge player came on at late last year with the Houston Texans. He's a younger guy. The Browns, this has been a position of need for them, not really getting what they wanted out of Jadeveon Clowney, letting him go. They need to generate more pressure up front opposite Myles Garrett. And under new defensive coordinator Jim Schwartz, uh, they're bringing in an extremely intriguing young player in Okoronkwo, who came on very strong with Houston in the second half of last year. 5 sacks over the last 7 games. His production skyrocketed from week 7 through the end of the year. He ranked top 10 among edge defenders in pass rush grade, according to PFF, pressure percentage at 17.5%, and pass rush win rate at 22.9%. You get him on a relatively cheap deal. If it works out, great. 3 years, $19 million. 6.33 million per year, $12.5 million guaranteed. I think it's a really good under the radar move by the Cleveland Browns, getting a young player like Ogbo, who will fit in this defense. I really believe that. If it works out, great, and you got your other edge defender opposite Myles Garrett. He was also very solid in defending the run. So look out for a move that could potentially pay big dividends for the Cleveland Browns. That was my honorable mention.
Okay, yeah, we had discussed the Browns and their team needs in our one of our earlier episodes, and defensive line was one of the biggest needs in terms of a position group in the entire NFL. So it was good that the Browns went out and addressed that right away. Um, okay, let's get into our top fives here. I'll let you start out.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go where maybe not a lot of people thought I would go with this. I wanted to sort of, there was a lot of guys in the secondary signed over the first week of free agency. There were some offensive linemen signed as well. Some big moves in the secondary. I wanted to diversify the position groups though in my list, so I went with the Raiders going out to get a guy that I think will complement Devontae Adams well after trading away Darren Waller and Jacoby Myers, the receiver from the New England Patriots, on a relatively good deal, 3 years, $33 million, $21 million guaranteed. Um, he's a guy that's played the last 4 seasons with the New England Patriots and showed some upside. He reunites with his former offensive coordinator and Josh McDaniels in Las Vegas, gets a pretty solid, get the ball out on time quarterback and Jimmy Garoppolo, so it's not a total disaster with the Raiders. I think he'll make for an interesting complement alongside Devontae Adams and Hunter Renfrow. I think they're getting him at a decent price. He showed upside. Hasn't always been the most productive player, and he's not going to put up the most numbers, but I think he'll be a pretty productive player. Devontae Adams will open some things up for him. Um, the word around the league at the NFL Combine, according to The Athletic, was that he was seeking roughly $16 million per year. But looking at, the similar deals around the league, what Juju Smith-Schuster got, I think you're really happy about this if you're the Raiders getting another receiver who you really can't have too many of nowadays in the NFL. Just a solid guy that will catch the football, get open. I think Devontae Adams will open some things up for him. And you have a quarterback with a really quick release that I think Jacoby Myers will fit well with. So that was the deal that I went with at my number 5 spot.
Right. Yeah, that seemed to be a theme with the Raiders this offseason, getting guys that Josh McDaniels is familiar with in his days back with New England. Obviously, Jimmy Garoppolo being the first name that people think of. But Jacoby Myers is an interesting one because I think at certain points in New England, he had some injury struggles, but when he was healthy, he was very productive and for the most part, was their most reliable target these past few years. So I thought that was a pretty solid signing as well. For my number 5, I went with a pretty underrated signing for the Miami Dolphins. I went with Mike White signing for 2 years, $8 million. For me, this signing, if Mike White had signed with pretty much any other team in the league that you could think of, it probably it definitely wouldn't have made this list. But with the Miami Dolphins being in the situation that they're in, and wanting to go all in and go out and compete for a championship, with the situation Tua has had the last couple of years, securing your backup quarterback is just so important. And also, you're getting a guy who last year proved that he would be a high-end backup for any team. And not only that, he ran the exact same style of offense as what will be run with the Miami Dolphins. So I think with the Dolphins, with the weapons you have a sports car for an offense. You just need someone who to drive the car. And Tua did a great job with that last year, but having that insurance for, if something goes awry is just so important for them. And I think Mike White will do a good job of that.
Yeah, I believe so as well. At my number 4 spot, I went with the Lions going out and addressing their cornerback situation with Cameron Sutton. 3 years, $33 million, $22.5 million guaranteed. A contract that I honestly thought the Steelers would give him, but they ended up not and electing to go a little cheaper with Patrick Peterson. But the thing I like about Cameron Sutton is there's two things I like about Cameron Sutton. He's a cerebral football player. He's very smart. Fourth round draft pick out of Tennessee. Um, so he's not, pretty good tackler on the perimeter, not afraid to be physical on the outside in the run game. But his versatility is really what I think the Lions are paying for here. He can play outside and he can play in the slot at a pretty high level. This was the Detroit secondary that ranked 30th in the league in terms of passing yards given up last year at 245.8 yards per game. Sutton brings great versatility. Um, he had expressed desire to return to Pittsburgh, but the Lions gave him the contract that he wanted, and he was interested in playing for Dan Campbell, which I do not blame him one bit. I think it's a good start for Detroit in addressing their secondary situation. They still got to do more, I think, but this is a very good start. Just getting a solid veteran-like player in Cam Sutton, even though he's still pretty young on a fairly fair deal, I think, for one of the guys that was an underrated player at the position last year. He was the top guy in Pittsburgh secondary, I thought. Um, I think it's a really good deal for the Lions. I'd give it like an A minus.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. He was a guy that I had thought about putting in my list as well. Um, I think this signing is more symbolic than anything for the Lions. I think it validates the changes in culture that they worked to make over the past few years, with the fact that guys outside of their organization are looking to come to them just because they're seeing what they're building and want to be a part of that. I think that really means a lot for an organization like the Lions, who historically has not been able to sign outside free agents.
Right. Absolutely. Who'd you go with that number 4?
At number 4, I went with Marcus Davenport signing a 1-year prove-it deal for $13 million with the Minnesota Vikings. Um, I think this signing was really good for Minnesota with the fact that Za'Darius Smith just requested a trade, wants to be paid big money. And then on the other side of that defensive line, Danielle Hunter, they just put on the franchise tag, but there are rumors that he most likely won't want to play on that franchise tag. He'll want to have that long-term deal. So having that, I'm going to say this word again, insurance of, if you have to get rid of a couple of those guys, for whatever the case may be, you have Marcus Davenport, who I think it's a low risk, big swing that could really turn out to be a high reward. He was a guy who the Saints traded up for in the draft at the number 13th pick. And in that draft, he was touted as one of the most physically gifted defensive ends in that draft class. And in the NFL, he's struggled with injuries, but he's still shown to be one of the best bull rushers in the NFL. And I think um, with Brian Flores coming in and what he likes to do, from a cover zero standpoint, I think a guy who can push the pocket at the very least, um, is a positive.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a guy I considered for my list as well. Again, insurance is so important, especially at the edge rush position, especially when a guy like Za'Darius Smith requests a trade. And getting him on a 1-year prove it deal is fantastic for a team that looks to be in the mix once again in the Minnesota Vikings. I really like that deal. Number 3, I went with a re-signing in the NFC South. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers get a big re-signing on their defense, getting cornerback Jamel Dean, re-signing on a 4-year, $52 million deal, $13 million per year, which when you compare that to some of the other deals that cornerbacks have been getting around the league, I thought it was a very solid contract. $26 million guaranteed. His market value, according to PFF, was a 4-year, $68 million deal, $17 million per year. but the Buccaneers, I think, got a pretty good hometown discount. Now, he was a guy that missed their playoff game against the Cowboys, I believe, due to a broken toe. Um, but I think, once reports surfaced after the season ended that he was in line to sign a really big contract outside of Tampa, getting him on this deal for one of the top young quarterbacks available on the free agent market and just in the game in general is exceptional value. He ranks behind only Jair Alexander for the Green Bay Packers and Jalen Ramsey now for the Miami Dolphins. And PFF coverage grade at the position over the last 3 seasons. He's a big physical corner, can cover with the top wide receivers on the outside. I think it's a big re-signing for one of the better young players on that Tampa Bay Buccaneers team in general. He's been a really good, solid football player the past couple of years, and I think he'll continue to do so. I thought it was one of the better re-signings of the free agency period so far.
Yeah, I agree. I actually had Jamel Dean at number 3 also, just because, as you mentioned, the value there is just so unbelievable. To be honest, I mean, when you're team building, when you want to build a championship level team, getting guys on your team who perform above the level of their contract is so important. And with Jamel Dean, it's it's pretty much guaranteed with the caliber player he is. If he stays healthy, that contract will be an absolute home run for them.
Absolutely. So we both agree, Jamel Dean. He was the guy that I believe you brought up in our last team needs segment when we addressed the Buccaneers. Um, yeah, I think that's a really big signing. So at my number 2, I went with sort of a package deal. Just the Broncos, what they did with their offensive line, I think is so important. They had some injuries last year, but they went out. They got Ben Powers at the guard position, a younger player, 2019 draft pick for the Ravens. I think he fits their running scheme in Denver and should improve their interior or run blocking in particular, but also provides extra insurance on the interior in in terms of pass protection for Russell Wilson. He beefs up that interior offensive line uh, quite a bit. Now, he is a younger player, and he was a guy that, honestly, according to reports that I've read, Baltimore was unsure he was even going to make the roster last year, but he did, and he really impressed and was a really good player for Baltimore in that heavy run scheme. Um, I think the Broncos are banking on his continued growth, but I think that's a really good signing. And then addressing the right tackle position with Mike McGlinchey, uh, I could make the argument that the contract, I think it was 5 years, $87 million, uh, is a little big, but I think when you have a need that big at the right tackle position with a veteran quarterback and Russell Wilson, who probably won't ever be the same as he was a couple of years ago with the things he can do outside the pocket just because of his age. I think that's huge. And they had to do something and they did it. So give them credit.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, the Broncos definitely, with the way they shuffled things around with Russell Wilson's deal to create some cap room, I think they probably did the best they can do with the cards they were dealt. And going into this draft, I think they're in a much better spot than I think a lot of Broncos fans thought they would be. So I think it's been a pretty successful offseason so far for the Broncos. Now for my number 2, I had um, Jesse Bates signing with the Atlanta Falcons. I think this deal, along with signing David Onyemata, defensive tackle, the defensive side of the ball for Atlanta, I think has really shifted a little bit. And as I mentioned earlier, him signing for 60 million per year again provides value above what his production actually is. Um, Whenever you have a player who produces better than what his contract would um, imply, that's just so important, especially for a team like the Falcons, who is trying to take the next step and compete for a playoff spot, compete for a division title. So Jesse Bates, I think one of the top, three, maybe top one safeties in the NFL, depending on who you ask. Um, Huge signing for the Falcons.
Absolutely. Quick update. My bracket is somewhat busted now as Duke loses to Tennessee 65-52 to advance to the Sweet 16 under Rick Barnes. That's a Tennessee team that's had some major disappointment come the tournament time the past couple of years, and they beat a really hot team with a lot of momentum in Duke, and they sort of Duke their success, not to carry us off topic, we'll get back on track here in a minute. Their success over their 10-game winning streak was really predicated on the defensive side of the ball being physical and their length. Uh, Not allowing teams to get into the paint was a really huge part of their success. But give Tennessee credit on doing the same thing to Duke that Duke wanted to do to them. Santiago Vesely made shots, and that's a really impressive win for a Tennessee team that lost their point guard in Zakai Ziegler, I believe, right before the SEC tournament started to a torn ACL. I mean, that's huge for Rick Barnes. Give him credit. Former Texas coach, big time win over the Duke Blue Devils. My number one, and I'm interested to see if this is your number one as well. For me, it was kind of obvious. This was a guy that I had been really big on coming in to the NFL offseason. That's Javon Hargrave. Him signing with the Niners, I mean, the rich get richer, right?
Yep.
4 years, $80 million, $40 million in guarantees. Credit his agent, Drew Rosenhaus, for getting him the contract he deserves. He's been one of the top interior defensive linemen. It doesn't, I don't think, get mentioned a whole lot in these conversations a lot of the time. But he was right behind, I mean, Aaron Donald and Chris Jones in pass rushing grades last year on the interior defensive line, according to Pro Football Focus. 60 tackles, 11 sacks, 2 pass deflections, 2 fumble recoveries, and a forced fumble. Really productive player. Still on the younger side. I mean, he's approaching age 30, or he already is 30. I can't remember which one it is, but I think he'll fit well. Uh, you know, under new defensive coordinator Steve Wilks. But I think that's a big time concern, that San Francisco had to address, not necessarily having the guy on the interior that can push the interior of the pocket fairly consistently. And I think Javon Hargrave will give them that. And he's solid at plugging up the run game too. It's a decently big loss for Philadelphia, but they can withstand that, I think. But man, San Francisco's defensive line now looks a lot more scary than it did, and that's something that is scary around the league, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was a big splash signing that a lot of people probably ruled out for San Francisco. But I've said this for years. John Lynch is, I mean, if not the best in the league in terms of GMs, but 100% top 3, top 5 in the league. Just consistency, being able to manage the cap year over year. They've had to, manage being right on the edge of that salary cap for years over years while being a contending team. And I mean, they've been able to, you know, navigate that beautifully over the last few years. And this is another example of that. They managed to, move around a few contracts. Obviously, they lost Jimmy Ward, one of their safeties in the process. But I think if you ask any 49ers fans, they'll trade Javon Hargrave's services for Jimmy Ward any day of the week. So, or other way around, they trade Jimmy Ward services for Javon Hargrave any day of the week. I think you know what I meant. But
Right.
anyways, I just think, man, the 49ers the fact that they were able to pluck him on top of that away from their biggest rival in the NFC, they got the team that they had just lost to in the NFC Championship game. It just makes it even sweeter.
Absolutely. Who was your number one?
That was my number one also.
Okay.
I think defensive line wasn't necessarily a need for this 49ers team, but I think with some of the question marks surrounding the quarterback position with health over the past couple of years, obviously their offense is still going to be good no matter who they have starting at quarterback, whether it be Brock Purdy or Trey Lance, in my opinion. But whenever you can improve that defensive side of the ball, which was already elite, by the way, I think you just have to do it. You know, making your pass rush even better just takes that much pressure off your secondary in terms of how much time they have to cover. You know, the amount of, exotic coverages they have to do. When you can just rush 4, it just simplifies everything for your defense.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that wraps that up. Real fast before we wrap this thing up, is there anything else, just free agent wise, not trade wise? I think we can address trades more in depth in another episode. What is there anything else that really stood out to you?
Well, just from a signing standpoint, well, I'll just address the Cowboys really quickly. We just cut Zeke, which I thought was a necessary move. We got Tony Pollard on to the franchise tag for this following year. So I thought it was a necessary move, and it was time to move on. And then another signing, the big one in my head was Geno Smith.
Mm-hmm.
A valuable deal, 3 years, and he's shown that not only is he, franchise level in terms of his level of play, but also his selflessness, his leadership. He's just a guy you want around, whether that be, even if, the final year of that deal, that third year, he ends up being a backup to whatever rookie they bring in. I think it still brings value just because of the presence he has on that team and how much those guys in that locker room respect him.
Yeah, absolutely. That's huge for Seattle. I think it's a fair deal, given what Geno Smith put out on the field last year. His leadership goes unquestioned, I think, a lot of the time, but I think people fail to realize that this is a guy that was highly touted back in 2013 coming out of West Virginia. He's got a big arm. Like, he's got a franchise quarterback level arm. He can make all the throws you need. And if he plays, anywhere similar to how he played last year at a similar level or even better, Seattle's in a really good spot with a lot of the young talent that they have. I think we've already addressed them in our team needs series, but getting that quarterback, ensuring that position for the next 3 years, while you maybe look for another guy, maybe a developmental quarterback that can sit behind Geno Smith for when you're ready to move on, is big time. So that's really the only thing that stood out to me. I mean, there were the quarterback moves. We address the Derek Carr to New Orleans move in another episode, I believe. I mean, the Garoppolo to the Raiders signing was, I mean, people have differing opinions on it, but
Right.
he is a proven winner. That's really all I can say about Garoppolo. He hasn't always been like the most clutch player, or he's not the best in like elevating your ceiling, but if you want to win some games, stay relatively competitive, it's a fair deal. I mean, the biggest question is his health, right? So I don't know. We'll address more free agency stuff in the future as we sort of like. I want to pretty soon transition to some draft material, even if it's not like the high end mock draft or like that sort of discussion, but maybe like start talking about some of these players, that sort of thing. So look out for that. Look out for another episode to be released in the next couple days. We're going to do an NBA, MLB, or maybe WBC episode. We're going to record that and release it in a couple days. I'm going to be doing my Longhorn deep dive this maybe tomorrow. We'll address Texas basketball and talk about what's happened so far at spring football practice with the Longhorns. That should be an interesting episode. Please go watch that. I greatly appreciate that. And then we'll have some Patreon content next week as well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in sports right now. I honestly was surprisingly entertained like a lot by that World Baseball Classic game that happened last night. I think it was Mexico versus Puerto Rico. I turned on that game just thinking, oh, this is something I can watch as I'm falling asleep. But man, that game had me locked in. I mean, that game was super entertaining. So that World Baseball Classic, probably not something that's on a lot of y'all's radars, but definitely give it a chance here as it's pretty deep in the tournament now. Semifinals here tonight, so definitely give it a chance.
Absolutely. So that's going to wrap it up. So enjoy the rest of the basketball this afternoon. Amy and I will be recording another episode, as I said, sometime today, hopefully to be released in a couple days. This one was live. Go like and subscribe. Share it with your friends. And tell us, who are your top 5, top 3? What is your favorite free agent signing of the free agency period so far? What has stood out to you? What has your team done? And also, what were your biggest takeaways from the first round of March Madness? Anything that's related to sports, you can put it in the comment section because we love that engagement. Or any questions that you have that you might want us to address on future episodes would be great as well. So, with all that being said, I guess just like the chances of my bracket not being busted totally, as Duke, my first Final Four team to lose, got ousted by Tennessee and Rick Barnes, we are going, gone.